dhimahi tanodanti prachodayat. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha Vagdevyaya cha vidmahe Kamapradaya dhimahi Tano Devi prachodayat. Om Aim Shrim Hrim Saraswati Devye Namaha Prabhakaraya vidmahe Divakaraya dhimahi Tana Surya prachodayat. Om Sum Suryaya Namaha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. My name is Brent BecVar. I guess my current role is the director of the Vedic Counseling Program at the Chopra Center for Wellbeing. I've worked for Deepak Chopra for about 26 years in different roles, and this has been my primary role over about the last 18 years, I think, after he had invited me to start this counseling program through the Chopra Center, using this kind of unique feature which we're talking about today called Jyotish, or often referred to as Vedic Astrology or Indian astrology. And by way of background, I had always been interested, I think, in some connection to when a person was born. Even as a little child, I often say, as a little kid, when I would find out somebody when they were born, it gave me a sense about them I didn't have before. And I felt that was always an important piece of information. And it gave me a little bit more, I felt a little more intimate connection with them. And as soon as I found out there was something called astrology, as I grew up, I began to really explore it with a lot of interest and a lot of curiosity. And I studied Western astrology over a period of about 20 years. During that time, I had become connected with a teacher, Swami Satchidananda, in my early 20s. Became a yoga teacher, a meditation teacher. It was at a time in my life where I was really wanting to understand more about who I am and what I am. And so I was attracted to a teacher and eventually went to graduate school, completed graduate school with studies in psychology, worked as a therapist for a time, mainly working with substance abuse clients. I eventually shifted to television advertising, where I worked for 10, 11 years. And it really broadened my my education, working with media and working with people in different businesses and kind of getting out of my own shell. And then at one point I was in a real crisis of what to do with my life. I wasn't finding the same fulfillment in advertising for me. And I really prayed and I just had a sense there was something I could do that was more in alignment with my nature. And I remember very distinctly just praying, surrendering and letting it go. And very shortly after that, this was, as I said, about 26 years ago, I met Deepak Chopra. And through a kind of a remarkable series of coincidences and synchronicities, I was invited to come and work for him in Massachusetts. And that began this current period of my life. And it's been such a wonderful time in my life, having that association with him and all the people that we work with. And I still teach there, I still lead some retreats, but mainly I enjoyed doing kind of one-on-one counseling, utilizing this system of Vedic astrology called Jyotish. Jyotish is a form of sidereal astrology as opposed to Western tropical astrology. Vedic astrology is very old. It comes from the Vedic tradition of India. It's often referred to as an integral part of the Vedic tradition, in that it's one of the limbs of the Veda, called a Vedanga. And as a Vedanga, it's referred to as the eye of the Veda, because Jyotish, the word Jyotish means, or Jyoti means light, Isha means Lord of or science of, so Jyotish is the science of light. And it's not just the science of inquiring into the stars and planets and constellations, but also the light of our own awareness that enables us to perceive and understand. So it's in many respects, it is a spiritual inquiry as well. Jyotish, as I said, is distinctly different from Western astrology in that it uses the sidereal zodiac, which is the actual observable positions of the constellations as we see them in the sky. Same zodiac most astronomers would use. Western astrology, on the other hand, uses the tropical zodiac, which means movable. It's based on the relative and the changeable position of the sun. It's a solar-based or seasonal astrology. It needs to be mentioned that Western astrology is no longer accurate to the constellations, astronomically speaking. It doesn't make it wrong or irrelevant, but it has to be read with that understanding. Vedic astrology uses this observable positions of the constellations. And there's a difference of about 24 degrees between the Western tropical chart, which has moved ahead, and the Vedic sidereal zodiac, which is, what any astronomer would have seen. I probably shouldn't get into too much about that, although it has to do with the subject of precession of equinoxes. And if people are interested in knowing more about this subject, there's a really fine film that you can watch for free on YouTube. It's called The Great Year. It's just 40 minutes long. And it's narrated by James Earl Jones and produced by Walter Crittenden, an astrophysicist. And this film kind of goes into more detail about this great cycle of precession of equinoxes, which is a fascinating subject. The other important distinction is that in the Vedic system, we don't think of a person in terms of their sun sign. We're more interested, you might say, in the position of the moon, as well as what's called the sidereal ascendant, or the rising sign. That becomes the key or the entry point into the Vedic chart. And there's so much more to say about Jyotish, but maybe that's a little bit of an introduction. One last thing we might say, just by way of introduction, is that, looking at a chart, a Vedic chart, we're looking at different planetary positions within the 12 constellations. And there's a further delineation of these planetary positions based on something called the nakshatras, which are the 27 so-called lunar mansions. And these references to these are very old in the Vedas. And they really add so much more dimension to the Vedic chart. But basically, these positions that we look at in the Vedic chart are reflect archetypal themes. So the different planets are often referred to as the gods and goddesses of antiquity. They reflect certain almost anthropomorphic qualities. Mars, for example, is often referred to as the god of war. And yet Mars, the influence of Mars can also give courage, passion, energy in its positive expression. And yet Mars is volatile and can also flip into its less positive, impatience, irritability, anger, conflict, criticism, and combativeness, competitiveness. So all of these planets have their positive expression as seen in the chart, depending on certain conditions that we try to uncover, and also, less positive expression. So, it's the job of a Vedic astrologer to try to unpack, some of the qualities of the planets as they're expressed, and how and the way that they relate to one another. It's a fascinating inquiry, because you really see that all of these qualities that we express ourselves through our personalities and through our habits are not really personal. They are archetypal themes that are universal, and that because of certain, you might say, karmic predisposition, we align with certain of these planetary archetypes and express them, for better or for worse, I guess. So the Jyotish chart is sometimes referred to in Sanskrit as a darpana. A darpana is a mirror. So the idea is to hold up the mirror, to say, these are some of the archetypal themes and qualities that are reflected in your particular horoscope as part of the karma that we came in with. And so we want to try to understand what are the talents, gifts, and abilities that can be seen among these archetypal themes, and how can we utilize these to further awaken from the sleep of the mechanical habits and not so positive habits that might pull us off balance, pull us away from presence, pull us away from a sense of connectedness with everything. So in that regard, it is truly a spiritual practice, because it's all about awakening to our true nature as consciousness and relaxing some of the identification with these different habitual patterns and karmic predispositions. I can speak for myself in that, when I first encountered Vedic astrology some 27 years ago, I, as I said, had been studying the Western chart for a long time, and my Western chart, and I had tried to fit into that chart. I often say it was like an article of clothing I wanted to wear, but it didn't quite fit. I was trying to kind of squeeze my way in. So when I first encountered Jyotish, and I met a Jyotishi when I first came to work for Deepak, it was like suddenly the suit fit. Suddenly I was like, I felt comfortable in in this particular combination. And as I said, the Vedic chart is 24 degrees different, so it changes a lot of the positions of the planets, and often even the rising sign, which is the key to the Vedic chart. So understanding this, I think it gave me, all I can say is it gave me a little more peace, a little more compassion for some of the tendencies that I had observed in myself, or did observe and still do observe. My rising sign is Libra in the Vedic tradition, in the Vedic system, Vedic chart, as opposed to Scorpio in my Western chart. And so Libra really made a lot more sense to me, just in terms of my own rising sign. I think I'd always been artistic. I'd always been interested in relationship. Libra is ruled by Venus, the planet of love, harmony, balance, beauty, artistic sensitivity. And so I just saw much more of a connection to myself as a Venusian type, love harmony in nature, seek for harmony in relationships. That's kind of one of the main qualities of Libra. Venus in my chart is placed in the 9th house, the house of higher knowledge, religion, philosophy. I'd always been interested in higher knowledge. I pursued even a formal, formally acquiring knowledge, even in graduate school, as I see many people doing that have the ruling planet of the 1st house in the 9th house. There's often a lifelong pursuit of higher knowledge. So this was very evident in my chart. Not only that, but I have the sun and the moon in the 9th house too, which is has become or has become clear to me as an important indication about myself in terms of my work as a teacher, a therapist, and my interest in Dharma. Dharma meaning the way we seek to align with natural law in a harmonious way. Because I feel like that's a lot of what I do in my work with people, is helping them to come back into alignment with their own true nature, so that that nature can be better expressed in service to others and in feeling connected, to the whole. And Dharma, this is maybe a little sidebar, but Dharma is often referred to as one of the 4 aims of life in Vedic science. 4 aims of life are Dharma, Artha, which means wealth or resources, and the way we acquire the means to live our purpose. Kama, which means desire or enjoyment. Once we get our survival needs in place, we look to expand our enjoyment, and usually we look for relationships with other people to share that experience. So Kama is a lot about our relationships. And the 4th is Moksha. Moksha means liberation or self-realization. So our spiritual values, or opening and awakening to the context of everything that we experience in our lives as consciousness. So Vedic astrology really does explore these 4 aims of life, and you can see them in the chart, having to do with different houses in the chart. But for me, I have a strong connection with the Dharma houses. So that particular subject has been a motivation for me through the 9th house. The challenges in my chart were also very evident to me, and the desire to go more into the mystery of who am I is clear there. And sometimes, we have to go through certain kinds of suffering in life in order to have the humility to really look more deeply for what I think of as a solution to the dilemma of being human. Mm-hmm. And so there's been that also in my chart that's motivated me. But also, for everyone that I talk to, there are certain very clear trajectories that you can see in somebody's chart, what their life path is likely to be. And as I said, the talents that support that. But also, we look at things like, for example, a unique feature of the Vedic chart has to do with different planetary periods that each of us will go through, a sequence of these from the time we're born until the time we leave the body. And so knowing the planetary period a person is in, it sort of indicates a lot about the karmic environment of that person and of their life in that particular time. Dharma is always seen as the first of the 4 aims of life. So if we're in alignment with our real purpose, if we're really connected to that sense of living what I'm meant to do, I think we're more likely to attract or acquire the means, the artha, that's appropriate for supporting our purpose, and not be looking for more and more and more stuff and money and, as happens for many people. Some people feel like I just have to have more and more and more money or power without it being in, relation to their purpose. So it can go over into the extreme of greed and imbalance that way. If we know our Dharma, then we're more likely to attract the relationships with people who will support our Dharma, people that are of like mind, people that are going to be more supportive of us in our work and our purpose, rather than seeking more and more and more pleasure or enjoyment, which can be the shadow side of Kama, where it can, in the extreme, become addiction. So it's important to have that connection with Dharma, so that we feel that we're not craving things all the time. We're feeling fulfillment in our purpose. And finally, moksha. Moksha is always present. And consciousness is always present, of course, like the air we breathe. It's like a fish in water. It's what it's the context of everything. So the more we awaken to that consciousness. The more we have appreciation for what is, and there's more peace and contentment, I think, and more a sense of the universal connection of everything. So, I mean, I think that is our ultimate goal, if you will. And a goal is not really the right word because it's already always so, but it's sort of the ultimate awakening, where we open completely to that. So, in our lives, we go through different stages of life, which are also seen in the Vedic tradition. Not to get into that too much, but the Dharma of a child is going to be very different, say, from the Dharma of an adult who is maybe working in the world and raising children, and it's part of their Dharma to be a parent or to be, to take on certain responsibilities with respect to family or community. And then the Dharma of an elder is going to be different still. Dharma of a child is more, kind of getting to know their bodies, for example. What is this? And how is this body experiencing the environment? And also as the child grows, learning the relationship to other children, to their family. So there is this question of who am I that's always sort of in the background, or what am I? But as we develop, we often, as a way of feeling safe, will develop certain personality traits. And, we call this ego, where we identify with certain things like the body, like the personality, which is a song and dance we've come up with in order to hopefully get along with others and feel safe, and certain roles that we play in certain relationships. So we tend, as we grow, to become a little more identified with limited aspects of ourselves. And this is also something you can see in the Vedic chart, what the tendencies are along these lines. And so I think the process of self-realization is kind of waking up to, first of all, seeing that the body's changing all the time and can't really be who we are. As Deepak points out, we make a completely new one about every 2 years. There's not a single cell that's there, after a couple of years that was there before. And so how could the body really be who we are? It's not. It's like an article of clothing we're taking off and putting on. As he says, it's not a noun, it's a verb. It's an experience we have, the body. Even though we tend to identify with it as me, it's not me. And same with the personality. It changes depending on who we're with and what we're doing. So that can't really be who we are. The roles we play are changing all the time. I have great respect for people that take on that role to be a parent. It's a lifelong commitment in a way. But I feel that if we have the desire to really be open to knowing who this individual is, this child is, rather than wanting that child to conform to some image of how we feel they should be, or living according to certain, it's a tough job for a parent, because the parent they want to protect the child. They love the child. They want the child to be safe. They want the child to survive, not only survive, but to thrive. And as they grow, to be able to become successful in their lives. So, I really feel that if a parent approaches their relationship with the child with curiosity and is really constantly inquiring, who are you? Tell me who you are. But even further, has faith in the fact that every child, every person, every individual has their karmic trajectory. And so we have to kind of be patient with our children to see, how and in what ways they wake up to their own talents, gifts, and abilities. And we can delight in those, certainly, and every individual has them, and to, put more attention on those so that the child feels seen. Everyone wants to feel seen. That's why Jyotish is, I think, has been a useful tool for me, because it's about light, it's about the eye, it's about seeing someone. And I feel that the real therapeutic benefit of this practice for me has been that people really feel seen a lot of the time. They feel seen as who they are. And that's real intimacy. If they don't feel they have to perform or be something in order to be acceptable, they can relax and they can feel whole. And so I think that we want to do that with our children. We want to find ways that they can feel seen as being who they are, and not as something we want them to be, to live up to our expectation or image or some idea of what's acceptable in society. I mean, it's a huge responsibility for a parent, but I think the more we trust the child to tell us who they are, the more we can provide a space for them to grow in the ways that are going to make them feel joyful and adjusted and all that. It's a simple response to a complex question, but I really feel the more we're just curious and surprised and not fearful, not think that we have to mold the child so much, but allow the child to reveal themselves. The elder person is, in some ways, they're letting go of their previous dharma as a householder, as raising children themselves, as working in the world and supporting a family and so on. They've done all that, they've completed that, and hopefully as they're moving into more, we could say, the Vata time of life, and that's a reference to the Ayurvedic metabolic profiles and so the Vata time of life is where things are kind of drying out. The physiology is drying out, so it's time for more rest, less movement, but also integration of our life experiences, hopefully in a way that an elder can make those experiences useful to the younger ones, advising or holding space for them. So I think the Dharma of an elder is ideally, in traditional society, a wisdom keeper, somebody that is a resource for the younger ones to come to and say, hey, what's it like? Give me some of your perspective on it. So that everyone has their place within the social order, and the elder is, a very important Dharma, and it's something we need to, I think, in our culture, be more mindful of, respecting the elders, as they say. Respect your elders. It's really important for all of us that we have that we honor that Dharma as well. Well, one thing's important to say about that is that I feel like I want people to understand I'm not in this work to tell people their fate. I wouldn't want anybody to tell me my fate, I find that to be very disempowering and limiting, and I don't feel like I have that right or that ability to tell somebody their fate. Although Vedic astrology can have certain predictive tools, I think of it as being like a karmic weather report. But like a weather report, if we get a weather report, we have a certain amount of choice of how to respond to that information. So my interest is not in telling people their fate, but in supporting people having more free will to make better choices in our lives, and to awaken to more consciousness, so we do have more free will and are not living just in reaction to our the conditions of our experience. So the process really, first of all, as I said, is to kind of hold up a mirror and say, well, these are some of the indications in terms of the ascendant type, and each ascendant has a ruling planet or a representative planet. As I said, for chart, my rising sign is Libra, the ruling planet's Venus. And so everyone has a ruling planet, we say, in their chart, depending on their rising sign. And we look to see, well, where is that planet placed in the chart? Which of the 12 houses? And what are some of the indications around that? What does that tell us about the trajectory of a person? And the kinds of things they will find important or may struggle with, you know. And then we look at the connection of other planets to both the rising sign and the ruling planet of the rising sign, as well as the moon, because the moon is a very important part of the chart. Moon reflects something called the manas, or the intuitive mind. I think of it as being that aspect of ourselves closest to the soul, where we each have a unique way of distinguishing between what is nourishing, that's coming in through the five senses, and what is not nourishing. So the condition of the moon is very important in how we, how we nourish ourselves through impressions. So these are the first things we look at. We also look at certain planetary combinations called yogas, or union of these planets, which are very important in seeing the flowering of certain karmas, the fruition, I should say, of certain karmas. When you get to a certain planetary period or sub-period, and you see in the chart, some of these combinations of planets together, they can reflect dramatic rise or awakening of certain latent abilities or certain latent way of being in the world, I guess. And at times, certain challenges too can be reflected in these. And of course, we always try to look at the balance between the gifts and the challenges. And and I feel it's important not to overly focus on the challenges, except to say, okay, here's a period or a particular combination that's showing up in the chart that may require some additional work on your part, and to try to support people in knowing what their abilities are to address those challenges. I love to do relationship compatibility analysis. I find it so fascinating, and I'm always intrigued to see how people find one another, even without the benefit of knowing the charts. And a lot of times, really good relationships, you'll see a lot of the synastry between the charts. And we look at certain things, for example, the relationships of the rising signs that I spoke about, the ascendants, often the relationships of the positions of Venus. Relationships with the moon signs is very important. In India, they've arranged marriages for thousands of years, looking primarily at the relationships of the moon signs, because where the manas goes, that's where the rest of us goes. And if there's good relationship between the moon signs, there's likely to be easier rapport or more natural rapport, understanding one another a little better. We don't want to be too simplistic about these things, but these are some potential guidelines that we can see how people will relate, how couples will relate. And I often say, if I were doing an astrological dating service, there are certain things I would try to do or try to find people. And I've talked to you about your own relationship and how you've got some really nice features there that have drawn you together. So yeah, and at the same time, I'll also counsel couples that are going through challenges, and you can see when some of those things are not in alignment, or if there are certain transits that one is going through that the other's not going through, that try to give the other person a little more perspective and compassion for what the other's going through, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a constant inquiry, about, as I said earlier, about how these archetypal themes are reflected in our lives. And I think, the more we can come to compassion for one another, just recognizing that none of this is personal. We're all doing our best in a way from our own level of consciousness, but we're all reflecting these archetypal themes. So I think when we can see one another with that perspective, with that point of view, we're less likely to judge. We're more likely to see others with compassion. And to me, that's the whole reason to do this. What I do is to come to a place of greater compassion for people, because we see it's not personal. None of this is personal. Sati is often a period that, you know, people in India look at with some trepidation. Sati is a Hindi term. It means 7.5, and it refers to the 7.5 years that it takes Saturn to go through 3 constellations: the one before where the moon was, the one where the moon was, and the constellation after where the moon was. 2.5 years per each of those 3 constellations. Sati is when Saturn goes over the moon, because as I mentioned, the moon is a very important part of our sort of reflects a very subtle aspect of ourselves. And Saturn is a big, heavy, cold, slow-moving planet. Saturn is often referred to as Chronos, so the Lord of Time, because it teaches us about the beginnings, middles, and endings of everything. So Saturn can be a tough teacher, and is often referred to as a malefic planet, although Saturn has its gifts, as every planet has its gifts. And so when Saturn goes over the moon, it is often a very vulnerable time. It activates or brings up certain old emotional patterns that we've all cultivated over time, and such that we have to face these patterns. We have to look at them. And ideally, if there's enough grace available, as there always is, but if we're utilizing that grace, we can inquire, are some of these patterns still serving us? You know, these old sort of mechanical defaults of the ego, you know, in order to feel safe, you know. So Sati, when Saturn goes over the moon, we often feel a kind of poked by life in some ways, sometimes extreme ways. And so, first of all, it's been very helpful for me in my own life when I was going through Sati to know I was going through it, to know that the period had a beginning, middle, and an ending. And it's been in counseling people on this subject, and I do often, because everybody goes through this once every 29.5 years. That's the natural orbit of Saturn. When we go through this, you know, we have the opportunity to let go of things that don't serve us any longer. Now, sometimes this can be dramatic in terms of even losing people in our lives. It often is seen, and it's even said in some of the scriptures around this, that Sati can bring the loss or affliction to one of our protectors, one or another of our protectors, our caregivers. So, you know, this 29.5 year cycle, the first time we go through it in life, depending on, you know, where Saturn and the moon were when we were born. But the first time we go through it, we may experience the loss or affliction to one of our great-grandparents or grandparents. 29.5 years later, you know, say we're in our 30s when we experience that the first time, or 20s even. Next time around, we'll be in our 50s and 60s, and we may be experiencing the decline of, or even the loss of, one of our parents. And then later on, you know, as we get into our 80s and 90s, we may experience our own we likely will experience our own transition. That sort of seems to be the way it goes. So I think it's helpful for us, first of all, to know that you know, we all are participating in these great cycles, not just the circadian rhythm of the cycles of day and night, or the lunar rhythms, the monthly rhythms, the yearly rhythms, you know, the seasonal rhythms as the Earth rotates around the sun. But these greater rhythms of these planetary, you know, I think of them as our extended body. You know, these are traveling with us all the time in our lives. I often feel when I look up at a planet that's visible in the sky, like Venus is right now, or Jupiter, I feel this kind of kinship. Like this is a presence in my life that's always there. It's always there, and there is always some influence, and this is an important part of understanding why astrology is of interest to us, because it's sort of helping us to understand our relationships with these greater aspects of our own being, and how those are how those relationships are playing out at any given time. But anyway, just back to Sati Sati, because it is an important question. A lot of people look at it with anxiety or worry. I feel it's important to really be present for the experience of Sati Sati, even when it's challenging. You and I both have known others, friends, and people that have gone through this challenging period, and it's really shown up in a lot of ways, either through loss or illness or complications around the life in some way. And it's important to recognize that rather than living in fear of this or shaking our fist at God and saying, I don't deserve this, this shouldn't be happening to me, to really just be present for it and say, I accept that this is, for whatever reason, this is my karma. Now we could say it's being delivered. Saturn is often referred to as the deliverer of karma. That we don't avoid it, that we accept it. I think the great lesson of Saturn and of Sati Sati is, I accept, not my will, but thy will be done. Om Namah Shivaya. And in doing so, we find that we are able to let go of things that don't serve us. We don't like to see people die in our lives, but everyone will. The body will go. So it's part of our lesson to go through grieving when that happens. This is also part of Sati Sati sometimes. So that we get to the place at some point where we realize that no amount of grieving is going to bring the person back. And so we just accept. Doesn't mean the love that we feel isn't still there. Sometimes if we're in a major period of Saturn, for example, and we experience Sati Sati, that can really be pretty severe. And you and I both have known people that have had that experience. And someone in the public eye who recently died, Anthony Bourdain, was in Sati Sati and was in the major period of Saturn and the sub-period of the Sun. And, you can't help but wonder if he had had the benefit of knowing that he was in that, and knowing that this period would have a beginning, middle, and an ending, and that a lot of the vulnerability and even depression that he may have been experiencing during this transit, even though this was someone who was living, at the peak of his career and seemed to have everything, in his life, that he may have been able to avoid what they call a permanent solution to a temporary problem, which is suicide, a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Upaya means remedial measures, and there are many of these in Vedic astrology. Some of them reflect different kind of esoteric or even seemingly occult measures, like use of mantra. Mantra is a very important upaya or remedial measure, and it has to do, there are planetary mantras, and you can use these to sort of, I think, to integrate more harmoniously with the influence of a planet, or to soften what might be a harsh connection to a planetary archetype. I think it's a way of connecting more and hopefully integrating more of the positive qualities and traits that are associated with that planet. And it's a more complicated subject, this idea of remedial measures and mantras. Some people wear gemstones, or gemstones are recommended. This is, again, a more kind of esoteric thing. Different gemstones are associated with different planetary archetypes. And gemstones are, kind of, they're condensers of energy, much like a crystal in a radio set, kind of you can tune in certain frequencies. Well, in the same way, gemstones are often utilized in that way to attune to certain frequencies that may be more helpful in aligning with the positive qualities of a planetary archetype. But other things, there are more kind of tantric things like, charity to a less fortunate person. For Saturn, for example, Saturn is often associated with poverty and people that are in wretched conditions in society. So making somehow the life of a person who is really downtrodden in life, who is really kind of weighed down under the influence of Saturn, to try to make that person's life better, feeding the poor or charity to the poor, charity to someone underprivileged is another Saturnian remedial measure. And there are other ones like that. So this is just a kind of a conscious attempt to integrate our relationship with a particular planet. And the difficult planets like Mars or Saturn or what are called Rahu and Ketu, the points of the eclipse, these are often influences that can pull us off balance. I often think of Mars as having our foot on the gas. It's like, what's next, what's next, what's next? It's like this urgency to get to some imagined future. And Saturn is pulling us back in the past, what happened in the past and how I don't want to repeat something in the present. So that future and past are often pulling us away from the real nourishment of the present, which is the only place nourishment can be found, really. Like we can't breathe in the past, we can't breathe in the future. So we want to find a more beneficial relationship with the difficult influences like those planets so that we can tap into the gifts of them. And when we do, for example, in SADI, this transit of Saturn over the moon, even though we may feel at times that we're getting like punched by life, I often say we come out of that period 7.5 years later with a lot more knowledge, a lot more wisdom, a lot more humility, a lot more compassion for others. There's a great teaching tale in the Vedic tradition called The Greatness of Saturn. It's a book you can get on Amazon. It was written by Dr. Robert Svoboda, who's a very fine Vedic scholar and Vedic physician and Jyotishi. And Robert transcribed this ancient teaching tale. And I won't go into all the details, but there's an allegory of a king who calls all the wise people of the kingdom to come and tell him which is the greatest of the grahas, the planets. And so one by one, each pundit will get up and extol the virtues of, say, Venus or Jupiter or Mars or the moon or sun or so on. Well, the last pundit to speak is the pundit for Saturn. And there's some, symbolism in that Saturn is the furthest of the planets from the sun, of the visible planets, or the true planets as they're referred to. So the pundit that speaks for Saturn tells another tale of another king who had everything. He had the greatest kingdom, the most powerful army, the most beautiful and strong castle, and the greatest wealth and gold, and the most beautiful family, wife and daughter, and the greatest strength and health. He had everything you could almost wish for a human being to have. And Saturn comes along and bit by bit starts taking things away. The army is defeated, and the castle is breached, and the gold is taken, and the wife and daughter are taken away. And the king loses his arms and legs in the battle. And he's lying there in the dirt, just a wretch in the dirt, suddenly has nothing, can barely move. He's been totally, humbled in a way. And so Saturn comes to him and says, you've endured all these trials I brought you without complaint. And because of that, I'll give you a boon. And you're wondering, what's he going to ask for? And the king looks up from the dirt and says, my one wish is that no one else will ever have to endure what I've had to endure. So he got the lesson, and because of that, Saturn said, you got the lesson. For that, I give you back everything, because he came to the deepest compassion through this experience of loss, experience of being humbled. Because everything has a beginning, middle, and an ending, and the sooner we get that, and it gives us perspective. I experienced a lot of loss when I went through SADI. My father died, my niece died. I lost 3 really dear friends. I'd never lost anybody before, and so that direct experience of the reality of loss, and the fact that the ego realizes there's nothing I can do. So there is a letting go and a humbling that takes place even there. I think the best remedial measure I had was just knowing that this period would have a beginning, middle, and ending, and not to fight. You can't fight Saturn. It's too big. So you just surrender. I did a lot of mantra, I think, myself at the time. I think I do a regular practice of meditation, which I consider to be one of the most important upayas for anyone, because it helps us to transcend some of our own unconsciousness, unconscious patterns that we could associate with these planetary positions and conditions in the chart. So meditation helps us to come more to our own essential nature, where we are free from a lot of these karmic tendencies. And so the more we meditate, I think the more those karmic tendencies ideally will begin to loosen. Our fear, our self-defendedness, our illusory sense of separation from everything begins to relax and fall away. So that's why, I feel like a lot of times when I'm talking to somebody about their chart, my true goal, if it's possible, is to help them to come to a regular practice of meditation. Because I think this can do more than almost anything to help us to let go of these artificial identifications and these old habits that keep us in a sense asleep and suffering. So that was probably the most important for me. But I think also I had the association of other good people. I think that's really important in terms of karma, that I spoke about before. Having a community of people that know you and kind of can hold you a little bit even when you're going through difficulty. And ideally, this is what we look for in a spiritual community, because different individuals are going through different experiences at different times. So, we want to be able to hold the ones that are challenged, and even in society at large. And that's why we say, help the poor. Don't reject the poor. It could be you on another occasion, like that king, where everything gets taken away. So we want to try to have charity all the time when we can, because we're all part of one being, one consciousness. Yeah. So this idea of upaya is an important one, but I think just in Ayurveda, we talk about having just a complementary daily routine, and that's another whole subject. But where one activity supports the activity that follows, so you get a good night's sleep, you get up, you do your morning cleansing, you do your morning meditation practice, just sitting, letting go, and silence. Then you move in, maybe do some exercise. You maybe do some asana practice or something if you haven't already, some yoga or some kind of exercise. And then you move into hopefully your Dharma. You into, how can I help? How can I contribute to the welfare of the whole? And of course, certain choices around food, around rest, around, basic self-care, recreation, enjoyment with appropriate companions and so on. All these things are part of the four aims of life that we talked about before, of living a good life. A good life means, a conscious life, in my view. And so we can utilize some of these practices to help kind of keep us help recalibrate, when we're starting to go off the rails a bit. when we're feeling anxiety about not having enough or worried that we're not going to have enough in the future, and we're forgetting to practice gratitude for what we already have and who we already are in this moment is a very important practice. The science of yoga, which is really the science of transformation, offers and provides so many important tools for us, and it's well worth our time to study these and put them into practice in our lives. Because I've had some very fine teachers in my life, and both in this country and India, and one in particular in this country I studied with for about 13 years. And during our studies, we looked at the charts of people with difficult lives or difficult karma, and certainly people that maybe we, had lives we didn't want to emulate, and how can we avoid it? But yeah, you can very definitely see these archetypal themes. Certainly in Hitler's chart, you see Mars. Mars is a very prominent factor in his chart. And not a healthy Mars, a very malefic Mars, and this was reflected, of course, in his life choices. That's a really good question, because you wonder, here we go back to this idea of fate and free will. I think Hitler, I haven't really studied him in great detail, but I think he had a kind of interest in the occult. But I think it was a distorted interest. It was more to have more power. And he was much driven by power and by a kind of distorted ideology. But again, you can only wish that someone that is driven in that way would come to a place of compassion and not separation. He was the kind of person who's tried to separate people in all kinds of ways, or create these tension. So it's hard to know, because some people, they didn't have the compassion from others in their lives. And that's the sad thing, you say to someone, well, because of this, and this in your chart, you have this potential for self-realization in this lifetime. And they will say, well, doesn't everybody have that potential? And you can say, well, sure, yes. Because we are already that. We're already that which we seek. We are already consciousness. But because of the overlay of certain karmas, it's harder for some people to kind of extract themselves from that limited identification and that fear that causes us to create separation and all the challenges that we experience. So, we pray for people that are deluded and limited in their identities, that somehow they'll get a sense, I don't have to be a separate someone in order to survive, that I can be part of the whole, that I can be part of the one. I always say, if we are available for the grace that is always available to us, there can be, redemption, there can be transformation, there can be, self-realization, as I said. But, I think, I remember Deepak saying something early on when I first met him that has never left me. I heard him say, think about love, speak about love, seek it and encourage it in everyone you meet. And I think that's a real good fundamental to live by, because I think even among people that are so deluded and are living in this life of fear, the more that we can bring love in our lives to whomever we encounter, there's a little bit more potential for them to relax their fear, to relax their illusory identification with something that they're really not, that we are really not. So I do think it is possible, but part of it has to come from us. We have to, sometimes we suffer until we get to that point where we realize, I can't do this alone, I need help. And like the king in the story, we are humbled and almost humbled to the point where we go, help, I need help. That's when the real transformation comes for all of us. So if we don't get to that place of surrender, we may stay stuck. So we want to try to align ourselves with whatever helps us to be able to relax that fear and that misidentification, so that we are available to the grace that is always available to us. There was one experience I had a couple of years ago. I mentioned some of the challenging influences in the chart, like Mars, Saturn, Rahu, and Ketu. Rahu and Ketu are the north and south nodes of the moon, the points of the eclipse. They're not actual planets, we call them shadowy influences in the chart. And I was going through a particular sub-period of Rahu, right at the same time that Rahu was going through my rising sign, along with both Saturn and Mars. So all three of the most malefic influences were going through my ascendant of Libra. And boy, did I feel it. I felt, at times, I just felt so weighed down by, the influence of Saturn is kind of this heavy influence where we can feel tired, we can feel kind of burdened by certain responsibilities, or even anxiety or fear about our situation, our physical health, our lives, well-being, whatever. So you kind of go into a bit of a distorted frame of mind. Mars is, as I said before, it's like foot on the gas. So it creates, when Mars and Saturn are together, it creates this tension, like having your foot on the gas and brakes at the same time. But also Rahu there. And Rahu often creates kind of compulsions, like looking outside of ourselves for something that we think will make us whole or complete. So that's why Rahu can also often be associated with addictions or addictive behavior. So it was right at that time I found myself really in a very difficult for me relationship. In that I was very addicted. I mean, I saw the attachment that I had to this person, but it was an unhealthy attachment, and it was almost like being addicted to a drug and going through some withdrawal when the relationship wasn't going well, and I could feel the symptoms of the attachment and just all the vulnerability that came with it. I mean, there were times, and I know many people have gone through this, when you're going through a difficult relationship. I was on the floor, trying to come to terms with these difficult emotions. At the same time, I was aware of the major period, the sub-period I was in, and the transits of these planets. And I knew I was in the grip of it. And so, I could have moments of peace or just objectivity, just observing these things in myself. And I could see, and I saw, as soon as Rahu moved out of my ascendant, it takes about 18 months, for that transit through a sign to go, or a constellation. It was something, it was almost like, okay, I'm done with that. I felt this relief. So again, this is like a karmic weather report. And some of the influences are very positive, when Jupiter's influencing your ascendant, you can feel very expansive and exuberant, generally speaking, all things being equal. You can feel a lot of, being lifted up or inspired, other things sort of like that. You can feel a lot of positive influences. But sometimes the negative influences, again, it's like a karmic weather report. If you're going through a big storm, there are certain things you need to do, or you may need to do, in order to navigate that kind of weather. I did a lot of inquiry. What is this emotion? What give it a name. What is the emotion? Where do I feel it in my body? How old do I feel when I inquire into this emotion? And that kind of inquiry can give us insight into, earlier times in our lives when we've gotten stuck in a life experience. We didn't have the tools to resolve it, and we had a difficult emotion lodge in our subtle body, and we drew a conclusion about ourselves. You know, I'm not worthy, I'm not strong enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable. You know, people will abandon you, people will betray you, whatever. You know, we draw these beliefs, we create these core beliefs that get stuck in our subtle body. So, you know, hopefully even when we go through those difficult times, as I was saying before, we can get insight if we're willing to look inward and not willing to just try to push whatever out there away or make that change in order that we feel better. To use that trigger of that experience to inquire into where did that emotion where did it come from, and to see that younger version of ourselves, hopefully with more compassion, so that we integrate that earlier experience where we didn't have the tools or the life experience to integrate it at the time. This is what psychotherapy is about, and you know, ideally, but you know, we can do this for ourselves in any moment when we're triggered by something in the environment or some relationship. So I did a lot of that, and I certainly did meditation. I did a lot of mantra. I really had to just observe myself in the midst of those situations, which was really not an easy time. I found also when I was, at one time in my life, I got great benefit from something called EMDR. You may be familiar with EMDR. It stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Reprogramming. It's kind of a long term, but EMDR, a lot of therapists have learned it, and it works really quickly to, I think, to bridge the gap between trauma that gets lodged in the amygdala and to bridge the gap to the neocortex, to where we come to the realization that whatever happened in our lives happened, and we can look at it without turning away or pushing it away. It happened. I didn't like that it happened, but it happened, and it's not happening now. You know, so even though things in the present may remind me or trigger, it doesn't have the same charge where we go into fight, flight, or we go into an inappropriate response to a condition. We just say, okay, it's sort of, I feel like the trauma gets resolved and integrated a little better through something like that. What I recommend to people is that they Google it, look up a professional association, EMDR association, and there are several. And in their website, you can find a therapist in your area, because I feel that if you're really going to do this, it's good to do it with a trained person, and even someone that has a lot of experience with this. But basically, it's sort of alternating it's sort of like a bilateral shifting of your attention between your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. Originally, it was done by eye movement, so the movement of the eyes would go from left to right, while maybe you're remembering or experiencing some emotion, difficult emotion, which might then guide you back into an earlier experience or memory of that. And when you're working with a therapist, then you can kind of share what happened, and that helps in the integration of it. So these days they use things like they have a little thing that vibrates in your left hand and vibrates in your right. So it's taking your attention from left to right. So somehow that helps to sort of relax some of the resistance to, kind of going back and remembering things and integrating them. After having gone through it with a trained therapist, I can kind of utilize that to some extent by even, bringing my attention to left, right, while I'm inquiring into an emotion. So it has become a useful tool that I can, utilize. But there are a lot of these kinds of things, and certainly yoga asana practice and pranayama can help a lot to integrate those kinds of things, So there are many tools. There's a lot on the internet now, you can explore, and there are a lot of teachers that have videos available, and some of those people may be more appealing to an individual. You feel more of an affinity for them and what they have to say. Some very good books. A lot of times I recommend David Frawley is a very fine scholar and teacher, and a resource, and he's written many fine books on Vedic subjects. But he wrote a great book called The Astrology of the Seers, which I think is a good foundation text, particularly if people are coming from Western astrology and want to learn more about it. He does a nice job of helping to include the Western subject as he's explaining Vedic astrology. And he also has a correspondence course that you can take, so it's not as expensive to get a good foundation and the knowledge. So Dave, and I forget his website, but you can just Google David Frawley and it'll give you Dr. David Frawley. And there's so many good books in English now, as opposed to when I was first starting. There weren't that many, but there are a lot of good teachers, and I think a lot of good books and resources available that I often will recommend to some people. It's called How to Practice Vedic Astrology. His name is Andrew Bloomfield. I haven't met him, but I like the way he laid the book out. It gives us, simple procedures for if you have a particular, what your rising sign is, what the ruler is, where that planet may be placed, or the ruling planet of a particular house in the chart. And each of the 12 houses has to do with different areas of the life experience. So you can kind of see, well, if you've got, Saturn in the first house, you can see what some of the things that might indicate. Again, it's a little bit of a cookbook approach, so you don't want to, identify too quickly with things like that. It's always better to have a teacher if you're really sincere and wanting to learn, and I try to support people any way I can that are sincere in learning, but it's often helpful to have a teacher, to have a variety of resources. There are classic texts like the the works of Parashara, and Parashara's Yoga Shastras. There are a lot of books that have been translated from Sanskrit and other languages into English that are available. These are more of the core texts, and there are many of those available now too. I think it's a journey, to start to inquire into this. I know for me, when I became aware of Jyotish, I would talk to anybody I could find that had any knowledge of it and inquire with them. And then through that process, I was directed to other resources and eventually to teachers. So I think it's a journey, but it's a useful journey. We're talking about more mundane astrology, more broad look at what's happening right now. And also, every country has its own chart. And for example, the chart for the United States the chart really works with Sagittarius ascendant. And so right now, Saturn, for example, in the sky is transiting the constellation of Sagittarius, which can create a more constrained or restrictive or fearful or conservative quality. And, it's just a simple interpretation, but my view is that that's what we're experiencing now. We're experiencing a lot more kind of fear, a strong conservative overlay. We see it in the media. We see it certainly in our political situation. And a lot of the stress that is associated with that. And it's a temporary transit. It will only continue through Sagittarius for about another year and a half, something like that. Then Saturn will move into the second house of the chart of the United States. Second house has to do with money and things we value, resources. And although there have to be other things to consider, it may bring about a more constrained experience of our economy. As we get into, say, 2020, we may experience a market correction, financial adjustment, even potentially a crash. Not to, again, project fear or negativity. It's just like a weather report. It might be a little bit more of a fearful time around money and finances or the economy of the country. So Saturn's a big player. We always pay attention to where Saturn is because it's a big planet. It's a slow-moving orbit. At the same time, we have Jupiter right now going through the 11th house of the chart of the United States, which I think in itself, kind of gives this desire to align with a particular group. And Jupiter is a more positive influence. I think right now it's helping in terms of our sense of prosperity. Jupiter will be there only until, I think, October, and then it'll move into Scorpio. So your question, mostly I work with people on their individual charts because it's a little bit hard to speculate in a broad sense. I mean, there's certain things that you can infer, from, for example, the chart of the U.S. or the chart of another country. And you referred to the yugas because we are very much in a transition point between what we could call the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. And these ages are about 2,000 years where the sun will be rising in that particular constellation. It's been rising in Pisces for 1,800 years or so, maybe. And in the not too distant future, it will move and begin to rise within the constellation of Aquarius, and that'll take 2,000 years. So that whole cycle is about 24 to 26,000 years, something like that. And the yugas that you talk about are often these periods of rise and fall in culture and even in consciousness that's discussed. I'm very encouraged as I look at these because I feel like, we're moving into a more ascending period of consciousness as we move into this age of Aquarius. I think it's going to be reflected in a lot more technological advancement, even than we've already seen, and we're just in the cusp period, the dawning, as they say, of the age of Aquarius. But I think it's going to really accelerate, for better or for worse, technology. But at the same time, hopefully there'll be more of a inclusiveness, a sense of we're part of the same, the same humanity, the same, we're not divided by these different artificial distinctions of race and nationality and religion and gender and all these things, that we're going to find more of a sense of universality. And according to this system, we're coming out of a very dark time, the Kali Yuga, and moving into Dwapar Yuga, which is the ascending Bronze Age. And so more can be seen in that film, The Great Year, that I mentioned. That's a really good overview of that subject. So during times of change of age, a lot of the old forms aren't working any longer. The old governmental forms, the old economic forms, the old social forms, religious forms are not working, and they're falling apart. And as a result, many people are in fear. They don't know what to hold on to. And so they're reverting to more conservative stance or even fundamentalist stance in order to just try to feel safe through what they sense is all this change and upheaval. What's really changing is, I think, consciousness and our relationship to consciousness, so I think all these old forms will fall away. And, it takes time, it's slow, that's the hard thing. But as they fall away, people will make adjustments and new forms will begin to develop, or new ways of relating to these different areas of life and either people will relax their fear and open up to the change, or they won't, they'll just stay kind of stuck in that. But hopefully those of us that are, interested in consciousness are hopefully part of the wave that's opening to these new forms and new ways of being. And it gives me hope, even in the midst of all the chaos right now and the fear and the difficulty, which is part of this change of age. it's like the metamorphosis when the dying body of the caterpillar will give birth to the butterfly, the chrysalis, the new form, the new consciousness. It's got to happen. There's got to be a death almost before there's the rebirth. So I think that's what we're going through right now. So for me, it's helpful to know that we are supported always by consciousness. We're never separate from it. And in fact, it is who and what we really are. So the more that we can align with that, the more we're, I think, we feel guided to make, better choices in our own lives, and hopefully experience that and support that in others. Namaste.